other trees that are around here. I mean, everybody hears this stuff. It's all over the place. You can Google that and find the phrase everywhere in many different articles. And I had to reconcile, like, which is it? Either that's true or it's not. Either all trees are beneficial and none of them are a hazard and need to be eradicated, or it's not. And that led me down the garden path. So these books are among those that I've read on this topic, and it took me directly into the heart of the issue, in my opinion, about invasive species. And there are some wonderful books. These two in particular, actually there are 3 or 4, but these two in particular are must-reads. They are just must-reads for people who are concerned about the environment, about deforestation, about native species, about the projections that it's billions of dollars of damage being done by invasive species, both plants and animals, as is now claimed. Not necessarily by the Claremont Canyon Conservancy, we haven't gotten into that, but just this is my view about where this issue really is coming from, what's underneath it all. And before I go farther would be here. Before I go further, I do kind of want to know who I'm talking to, because it does flavor the talk. So, who here, I'll say this, who's kind of here to gather more information, isn't really sure? You've heard a bunch of things and it's confusing and you want to learn more.
Definitely want to learn more. So I have.
Well, you seem to have come to an opinion. No, I'm serious, because it's a different talk versus, there's these people who are really entrenched in their views. I am admittedly entrenched in my views, and I'll hear everything. I've read tons of both sides. I like to think I could give Bob's talk almost as well as he could, although he could talk more about electric bikes. But I just think I've gotten to the underlying issues, and ultimately, underneath all of that, behind these books, is this book, which I read coincidentally in high school when I was dropping out of community college my first year, The Nature of Prejudice. I was told by a dear landscaper friend of mine who is in my photographs posing naked with trees, and also a contractor friend of mine, a dear friend who loves trees and nature and poses naked with trees in my photographs, the Tree Spirit Project, and both said, you want to pull out the broom. I mean, everybody can agree on that, right? You want to get rid of broom, it's invasive. Even if eucalyptus trees, well, that's a bigger issue, or trees is a different thing, but broom is bad. Everyone knows that. I mean, really, there's so few people that think broom is a wonderful, lovely plant we should leave it be. So I did what I was dutifully told. I believed my friends. Why wouldn't I? Right? There's no other agenda with them. It's a pure belief. And this comes back to the heart of this issue. So I wasn't going on an eradication program, but whenever I saw broom, I'd pull it out by the roots. Just get the broom out of there, because it's going to take over. It's going to push out the good native, air quotes, very important air quotes, native species. I got into this issue, flash forward 8 years, and I was finally able to pull myself back enough into the issue to ask, forget what my story is about native, non-native, broom good or bad, what's actually going on with this plant in my property? Did it push out other plants? Did it crowd out the good native poison ivy? Excuse me, poison oak. I'm from the East Coast. Poison oak. Well, no, poison oak is all over the place. I wish I could make some of that go away. Although I don't pull it out, nor do I put herbicides on it. But I decided on my property, specifically my property, no one can argue with this, on my property, broom wasn't doing any harm. But that's where I realized, oh my God, this is a human behavior. We can be taught to be prejudiced against something and not even know we're prejudiced. And that, my friends, is what I say is exactly the same thing going on here. So these good people who we may, heatedly disagree with, I don't think there's any for them. There are for other players in this game, ulterior motive. For them, no. They believe it, and I was just told by Bob that he does habitat restorations, which many people do. Many Sierra Club chapters do beyond the Bay Area chapter here, which supports this eradication drive of eucalyptus trees. It's a belief system. It's an ideology. And that's why when people say, well, Jack, if what you're saying, but aren't they more flammable? They must be. When I say, no, they're not, and there's no science behind that, there's no proof of that, they say, well, why would they do it? I mean, the Sierra Club, my God, who doesn't like the Sierra Club? I was a member for... I love the Sierra Club. I think they overall do a great job, and it's sort of like picking on... No, let's not go into politics. Don't even mention a full politician's name. That's a cul-de-sac. So, good people can, I think, believe different facts and have a different ideology and be led down the nativist path to have species preference. And I think before this whole issue and these big projects began, there was already in place a very strong ideology of these are eucalyptus trees, non-native species, and we want them eradicated. And then, of course, what happened? The 91 Hills fire. And that's where it gets really freaking fascinating. I've got 3 studies, and I have a boatload of literature here on this stuff. I mean, I bring papers instead of just doing the McCarthy thing. I know that fire scientists in Australia say they're bad, or Carol Wright says they're bad. Like, let me see it written down, and what are those credentials? And then ultimately, I'm going to come back, well, maybe I'll come back to this point. With whatever you hear from me, and with whatever you hear from Bob, and with whatever you hear outside of this place, I love quoting one of the wisest men I've read, who I've never met and never will. See if you can tell me who said this. Believe nothing. No matter where you read it, no matter who said it, even if I have said it, unless it agrees with your own wisdom and your own common sense. Anyone know who said
Sartre
that?
could have said it.
Buddha?
The Buddha. Could have been a lot of people, but
Yeah.
I really go back to that because I think whatever side of this debate you're on, it's very easy to abdicate your opinion to an expert. And yet, you should read the experts. You
I'm
should
sorry,
read.
would you say that one more time, the quote?
Believe nothing, no matter where you read it, no matter who said it, even if I have said it, unless it agrees with your own wisdom and your own common sense.
Thank you.
You can Google that. Food is all over Google. So, what I recommend is if you're into this topic, these are great reads, particularly this one, Beyond the War on Invasive Species. She's a permaculturalist, and there are permaculturalists even split by this issue, specifically about eucalyptus trees, and even about native, non-native, and even, amazingly, about whether to use herbicides or not. With herbicides, I'm pretty much an absolutist. I do believe in modern medicine and science, and I believe in antibiotics because they help me specifically, and that educated me. No, antibiotics are great, science is great, it has a place, absolutely. But herbicides on the land to fight invasive species, I learned from this book, it goes into incredible documentation, which you can double check, and it's easily available to double check. Guess where the war on invasive species ramped up? And as I say, the native plant movement, which was well intended and made some reasonable arguments about, well, this beautiful bay tree has been here a lot longer, that lovely oak tree has been here a lot longer, so it's more adapted to the landscape, and anything that comes in from somewhere else could potentially outcompete it. Right? So I mean, it's like, well, there's some sense to that. It's not completely full of shit. It makes sense. But what happened was it went from, I prefer these trees, so I want to plant more of these trees, to wheels come off the bus and the bulldozer treads come on and it's kill everything else. And how do we do that? Poison, herbicides. So what a surprise. For instance, Monsanto, not in agriculture, which is already a multi-billion-dollar market for that company, as well as Dow and Syngenta and Cargill, but then also the federal government bought, guess how much? I quizzed somebody earlier today, so don't say if you know. Guess how much money the federal government, the U.S. federal government in 2014 spent on buying specifically Monsanto Roundup, specifically to fight invasions of plants? Good question? How much money did the U.S. government pay Monsanto to buy specifically Roundup, specifically to kill plants that were labeled invasive?
$1 billion.
That's exactly correct. $1 billion. 2014.
But we don't have money for a post office.
Actually, you can.
How much did Monsanto pay?
So what,
Well,
he only
some-
has 20 minutes. He's halfway through, so
Okay,
we
so
gotta let Jack talk.
Questions come later.
Yeah, questions come later.
They do.
Who wanted to?
That's
Anyway,
true. We can pass it around.
so the bookmark I think is in a spot, and I've highlighted a lot more. But the point is, I don't think that the debatable fact is that billions of dollars being made to sell herbicides to all sorts of government bodies, federal and state, to poison invasive species, plants and animals. It's like someone just told me, which I like, that can't be true. That can't be true. They're aerial, unlike here, it's not aerial, but they are, you know this one? Dropping rat poison on the Farallon Islands to kill rats, which have overpopulated and are taking over. And, you know, they may be. I haven't gotten into that issue. I wouldn't have a real firm opinion about it. But I raise an eyebrow and wonder whether dropping from helicopters huge amounts of rat poison on the island to kill rats is really the only solution, the proper solution, and isn't doing huge amounts of collateral damage. And we might even all agree on that. I don't know. And that's kind of a side issue. But I have the opinion that it's the same mentality. Kill the invader. Kill the bad species. Which brings us to eucalyptus. So, kind of in this context, I don't care whether it's native or non-native. I think those terms are absolutely unscientific, and there's no scientific data to draw that line in the sand and say it's with European immigration, which is what's been done. And even that's a shifting line. And then there are numerous exceptions to that. So that's native, non-native, and then there's a second accusation, which is invasive. They're invasive, which is to say they're doing harm. They're either going to crowd out a good species, whatever that means, or a native species, which is a nonsensical term, or it will somehow, by lots of eucalyptus trees growing right there, you can see huge amounts of eucalyptus trees, that is destroying these better trees, these non-Mexican, non-Muslim locals, not those dirty, messy immigrants. And I'm not joking with that stuff. It's the same mentality, and that's when I give these talks, that's where I go. And the other topic, of course, is fire danger. All of this is trumped by fire danger. If it's true that that is a huge fuel load, messy leaf litter, firestorm waiting to happen, like in '91 when eucalyptus contributed so much fuel to that fire, we know they're going to do this again. Well, that would trump everything. Then it's reasons out the window, and I'm trying to save my home and I got to cut those trees down. So that we have this good, better, less flammable environment of non or less flammable native plants. To which I say, respectfully, bullshit. It's just not true. There is no established fire science. There has never been a policy of cutting down forests of any species, including eucalyptus trees, which have been here over 100 years. I call them a naturalized or exotic species because that doesn't have the charge of invasive. That is a word just like weed. Weed means I don't like it, I don't want it, get it out of here. There's no science to that term. There's no science to the term invasive. I mean, even people in the movement will argue about, is that plant, well, is purple loosestrife invasive? Are zebra mussels doing more harm in Lake Erie, or are they cleaning it up actually, and we were wrong to poison it, or tried to, because we couldn't kill it anyway? Think we're going to kill French broom? Do you think we're going to kill all the weeds on the side of the road here spraying Roundup for years, which is what happened in this project if the eucalyptus trees are cut down? No effing way. So as for fire danger, how many minutes do I have left?
You have you have a little more than 5.5.
Okay, so let me just touch on fire, because we need to address that. Are these more flammable? So I learned this one, and I could do 20 minutes on this, because it's just fucking fascinating when you get into it. I used to live in San Francisco. UC, beloved UC again, in San Francisco, wanted to cut down eucalyptus trees in Mount Sutro. And how do they do that? They went to the federal government and cried fire. It's a fire, these are fire hazards. We need money from FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, to get federal money to cut down the trees, to protect us from fire danger. FEMA said no, it's a fog belt. And we all would agree that it's a much wetter, moister environment there, it's different than here. So that wasn't enough to convince me of here, but it made me realize that people will lie, or, misrepresent the truth, that they were a fire danger, to get millions of dollars. Now, why would UC do that? My opinion, I have no factual proof for this, is for future development. That money is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know why else they would do it. It wasn't for fire danger. There's never been a fire there. And it was originally a grass hillside. I say a big forest there, just like a big forest here on what was a grassy hillside 100 years ago perhaps. I say that's a benefit. We should be thanking those trees and planting more of them. These guys will probably point to a landscape of there's a postcard going around from the, 100 years ago, the Claremont Hotel with grassy hills behind it. Has anyone seen that? I have that picture to show. Wouldn't it be great if I just totally convinced you, said, oh my God, Jack, you're right. I give up the debate. And I look at that and I see, it was fascinating because he and I will see two different things. He'll say, that's what it was and that's what it should be and it's less fire danger. I'm guessing. I don't know. He's going to say his piece and I won't interrupt him, so thank you. What I do is say, gee, that's interesting. That's what was there 100 years ago. It may not have been there 500 years before that. And why would you say that's the idealized one? In a word, I describe that as the rosebud phenomenon. it's a nostalgic, oh, it's a lovely, it's beautiful. I mean, aesthetically, it's beautiful. I have that in San Geronimo. I look across where they log redwood trees, and I see these grassy hills, and initially I used to think, oh, there's less to burn. There's less fuel to burn. It's safer. But what I've since learned is that grasses spread fire phenomenally fast. All this stuff that's grown up here after the forest went down and it's baking in the hot sun, that's a frickin' fire hazard. What do you think's going to ignite? It's a great demonstration area. It cracks me up that we both come to the same area, look at the same stuff, and come up with two wildly different conclusions. They say, look at those trees, look at all the fuel in there, look at all the brush, look at the fuel, the fire ladders off the bark, blah, 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 blah. Big explosive fire is going to throw embers all over the place. I know all that stuff. Instead, I look and say, well, there's some truth in that, of course. Although all trees with crowns have crown fires. Redwoods have taller crowns, so they'll throw embers farther. What throws embers farther in a fire are houses. And then I want to touch on one issue which I'm going to get into more. It's never been policy. I said this before, and I'm going to say it 3 more times before we're done today. It's never been fire policy to cut down forests to protect against forest fire. Even the U.S. Forest Service, who is, not the most progressive bunch of guys, put out a study that said, yes, it's in ways I don't agree with, by the way, that it's flammable and all the issues I mentioned. However, complete removal of overstory trees can introduce changes to the environment which increase fire behavior in undesirable ways. First, this is the U.S. Forest Service, and I have one of these for anybody who wants one.
It's not the U.S. Forest Service. It's an agency that works for them, and
Bob,
nobody knows.
come in later and we'll have questions to each other.
Okay, he says it's an agency. I will get into that. First, the removal of overstory is likely to result in rapid establishment of native and non-native herbaceous and brush communities, which is exactly what we got. They predicted it. This is done 9 or 10 years ago. Bringing an increase in available surface fuels. And again, I got just a couple minutes left. The other point I want to bring up, you don't need to cut down a forest, because even if you do, and even if you could just magically remove the trees like a nose hair, just remove them without chainsaws, without bulldozers, without years of work and millions of dollars. If you could do that, it's a great PR word. Just remove the trees. You're going to get that. And that spreads fire to houses and structures faster than any frickin' forest of any species. So what you do is you cut defensible spaces around your house. In the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, there's a guy named Jack Cohen, a fire researcher, also for the U.S. Fire Service out of Missoula, Montana. I brought a copy of his paper for everyone who's interested, and it's amazing. It's brilliant. You just make your house not ignitable in what he calls the home ignition zone. You make your house not ignitable. Had that been done, we would probably all agree on that. In 1991, the embers from other houses, from eucalyptus trees, from redwood trees, from all material that was in the air, throwing embers everywhere, it wouldn't have ignited as many houses. Then those houses wouldn't have ignited, throwing even more embers. Faster, bigger, more powerful. Planks were seen flying through the air. It was a firestorm, of course. So how do you stop a firestorm? Do you need to cut down a forest a half a mile from your house? Some would argue, yes, you do, because those embers would throw. Well, if you sweep your roof, move dead brush away from your house, cut down any trees that are overhanging your gutters, sweep your gutters, your house won't ignite by embers being thrown a quarter mile or 20 miles. It doesn't matter. And if you don't protect your home that way, nothing will save you. You can cut down all the forest you want. The grasslands are going to deliver that fire to your door, and that's what happened last fall with at least 3 70,000-acre wildland fires, which were grass and brush driven. The Rough Fire, the Valley Fire, the one that destroyed Middletown and destroyed Harbin Hot Springs, nothing to do with eucalyptus trees. Now the other side will say, well, thank God we took down, if there were ukes there, we'd have to take them down. So it's not about cutting down forests, never been the policy. Thank you.
And now for Bob.
So I do agree with Jack that there are people that are called native plant people that really believe that there is some sort of ideal. I'm not one of them. I don't believe anyone in the Conservancy is actually one of them, even though we work closely with Native Plant Society, the Sierra Club, and other environmental groups.
Yeah, I think.
I came onto this issue. I'm a wildland steward. I work with Garber Park and the other neighborhood organizations that take care throughout Oakland, the little parks and the little green spaces that we have within our urban wildland interface. And this is what makes this unique. This is not a forest. This is an urban wildland interface. And the Conservancy itself has been working, I mean, even before the Conservancy was created, to get the Park District to buy up all the land on the other side there, working with the university, to try and make this a more accessible to the community urban wildland interface. Now, I love the eucalyptus trees, quite frankly. I love the oil, I like the smell, I think they are beautiful. They make, I mean, some of the most incredible, they're huge, the way that they're, the branches come out, and I mean, they're really beautiful trees. I do not hate eucalyptus trees. There are people who hate eucalyptus trees. They're out there, and you can't reason with them because they don't want to hear it. There are no plans to remove all the eucalyptus trees. It would be $1 billion. We just don't have the money. There's too many eucalyptus trees. You couldn't get rid of them. And that's not what this is about. FEMA spent more than $5 million on an environmental impact study, paid Fish and Wildlife to do a biological opinion for a $5 million grant. They spent more money on the grant, now they're going to spend even more money on the lawsuit because the science is not settled. The reason the science is not settled is because the Forest Service, for instance, they've never done overstory removal. Why would they do that? Our forests are a crop. You may not know this, but up until like the 1980s, triclopyr, the garland that they used to paint the stumps here, as you can see here where they took out the eucalyptus, all these stumps were poisoned. They take and they put on the outside ring, the cambium layer, they drizzle on this stuff. It gets sucked into the stem and it kills the roots, prevents it from resprouting. They used to broadcast spray that all over our forests. And the reason is we had the tan oak tree. Now the tan oak was a staple for the native people who lived here. They had the best acorns. The tan oak tree was what we used. When settlers got here, well, we started girdling them and stripping the bark off of them because it had a lot of tannin. And it wasn't until they imported the black wattle, or the acacia tree, which has even better tannins, that they no longer had a use for the tan oak trees. So, but the crop, the commercial crop, was the softwoods, the pines, and your firs. But so they have needles and they won't collect the triclopyr, so they just broadcast it over our forests to kill the tan oak trees, suppress them in favor of the crop. And so that's the science of forestry. It's all about raising a crop.
We'll pause it.
Pause it for the plane.
So when I started hearing the different perspectives, the different viewpoints, different interpretations of the science, what I found out was most everything that Jack said is correct. Eucalyptus trees are not flammable in the sense that they just ignite. They're actually quite fire resistant. The barks do not ignite. You need a hot fire to get the eucalyptus burning. And grass fires, grass is exactly right. That's where most of your fires start. They spread quickly, but there's a difference. Let me talk about fuels for a minute. There's 3 types of fuels in fire science. You have what are called ground fuels, you have what are called surface fuels, and you have what are called aerial fuels. Now, surface fuels are like your grass, your brush, the leaf litter laying here. It'll ignite really fast, and as long as it's got enough fuel-air ratio to it, it'll move pretty fast. It's dry, depending on the moisture content, but it's not an incredible amount of fuel, and a firefighter can control it. they can take a bulldozer and they can cut a swath and start wetting it down, and that fire is probably not going to jump that fire line. They can get it contained and they can control it. Surface fuels, unless they're really a whole lot of fuel, are generally controllable. But when you have aerial fuels, and aerial fuels include ladder fuels, well, now you get into a type of fire. It's not that we're going to stop fire. We want to control fire behavior. So when you get into something like this over here, if you get a fire, a hot enough fire to ignite, and there's a lot of fuel underneath those trees over there, you get a hot enough fire going that it actually starts burning. It's a very hot fire. And these particular trees, they all died back in the 70s. And they came in and they harvested them. They froze, and they came in and they harvested all of them. They cut down all those trees back in the late 70s. And they've resprouted from the stumps. They're called coppice suckers. So as you can see, the trunks are very close together. If those trees burn and those trunks ignite, and what will happen is, because of the oils in them, those trees, they'll actually be shooting flames. As the oils inside the trunk gets hot, it will burst out in a flame, and it's like a flamethrower. And when you get them close together like that, you end up with a torch that you can't dump water on fast enough. You cannot put that fire out. The only thing to do is to back away from it and try and contain it somehow. And if you're looking at a flame that could be twice the height of the tree there, and you've got all this bark that's stringing down like this, and anybody who's kicked a campfire knows that you've got a stream that carries embers up into the air, straight up into the air. So now you're talking about throwing burning embers into the air 1,000 feet with a hot wind blowing this way towards our homes. And once that starts happening, it's a nightmare for the firefighters. I've talked to the firefighters that have fought eucalyptus trees, and I was complaining about the fact that I didn't like hiking under the eucalyptus trees because of the seeds that they drop. They're like marbles, you know. So if you're going up a hill and you step on them, you know, they roll under your feet. And he says you ought to try and put one out, because what happens is those seeds also have oils in them, and they catch on fire and they do the same thing. The oils vaporize inside the shell. When they burst out, he said it's like firebrands. You know, you've got these little missiles, like little fireballs coming at you. And they're hitting, you know, like this, you know, and those are what the trees do. This bark, all these eucalyptus trees have a high fat content. So when the bark, it gets up in the air, it can burn and smolder for hours, because it's just like a candle. It has the oils in it, so it doesn't burn everything all at once. It burns slowly. As the oils get hot and vaporize, you get the fire, and so they'll burn for a long time. So I guess the point I'm getting at is that this isn't about native versus non-native. The broom is, if you want to have broom in your yard, fine. It will tend towards monocrop. The thing about, there is a scientific definition of invasive, and that is a species that outcompetes other species. Whether it's native or not, it's still invasive. Eucalyptus trees are invasive in Australia because they tend to produce monocultures, because they outcompete everything else. They grow really, really fast. They hog up all the water, and they actively suppress germination, and through the dumping of their bark, they drop their branches. Their branches are actually quite brittle and tend to fall more often. So they generate a lot of surface fuels. And those surface fuels will carry fire, and if they have ladder fuels, which they tend to have because the bark falls off of the side of the trunk and comes down, and it leaves a ladder up the tree to get up into the crown, you end up with what's a catastrophic fire. Very, very hard to control. So what FEMA has said, okay, it really makes sense. They did computer models, fire models. FEMA used one, UC Berkeley used another. UC Berkeley's was actually a much more sophisticated fire model, but the standard one that FEMA used still pretty much said, well, these are the areas that are the most dangerous. These are the areas that where it makes sense to remove the trees. And then they understood it was a political issue, so they and they also understood there really isn't any science that confirms one over the other. There's no science for overstory removal. This here where we're at right now, this is it. This is the only place where they've actually done an overstory removal, and we can come and look and see what happened. And it's got mixed results. I know, I don't think that, I think that they started out with a good idea, but then, by, moving personnel around, pretty soon it just kind of got lost. And then with the whole issue and the fighting, the Conservancy hasn't been able to, we spend a lot of time working on the issue with FEMA and working on other issues, and we're not getting out here enough to start focusing, getting neighborhood volunteers to come and take care of this, because the university said, well, it's great, let's put in some fire roads, we're going to need access roads, make it trails, let people come enjoy it. It could be better. It could be better. And that's what we want to do across the street. We want to
Look this way when you talk,
we want
please.
okay, we want to continue the trails. We want to make it so that you can take the panoramic trail all the way up to Grizzly Peak, come back down around through here, or you can go up through the other side, down towards Galveston, and just, we want to open the Claremont Canyon to the neighborhood, to our guests, people who come visit. And we can't do it the way it is now. Number one, we're not going to get volunteers to come out and clean up after eucalyptus trees. They'll come out for the native plants. They want to see all that. They want the education of that. But they won't come out. Number one, how do you clean up under a eucalyptus tree? There's nothing. It's a bunch of branches and stuff. You have to really scrape and remove a lot of surface. So I've heard, one of the arguments that I've heard was about wood chips. And chipping the trees is creating a hazard. Now, remember I talked about there's three types of fuels: aerial fuels, surface fuels, ground fuels. Ground fuels are the least hazardous fuels of all. Ground fuels are fuels below the surface. So when you put wood chips down, they're ground fuels. You take an aerial fuel and you put it in wood chips, you've now created a ground fuel, because all the fuel is below the surface. Now if they do ignite, they tend to smolder for a long time. Ground fuels are ground fires are the fires that they spend most of the time mopping up, because those are the fires that are smoldering under the surface that they have to go through, they have to rake and find those and then put them out. That's what your wood chips become. Now that's not going to spread fire fast. It's going to burn for a long time, but it won't spread the fire really, really fast. Much, much slower. Broom also tends to be a monocrop. It does because it grows really fast, and it starts hogging up the resources. But it's also a legume, so it also fixes nitrogen in the soil. There's many benefits that both to the trees. Broom, everything has a place. And really, what it comes down to is what makes the most sense in our urban wildland interface. And the broom also gets really, really dry at this time of year. Very, very low moisture content. So now that broom becomes a surface fuel, a highly flammable surface fuel, which will also bring a flame length up and can get us up into the crowns. Now, Jack's absolutely right. Any tree will cast embers, including our native trees. I disagree about redwoods. The thing about redwoods is that they don't burn like pines. They are a very, very moist tree. We had a redwood fire up here. Somebody started a fire up in the second redwood grove here. It was contained. It took about over half an hour for the fire department to get there, and then they couldn't find it because it had mostly burned out. It burned up about 30 feet into the redwood trees, and then all that was burning was the brush that had started it had burned, the loose brush. The only thing that was smoldering was some eucalyptus logs from where they did what they call a lop and scatter in some of these areas where they just cut the trees down and they place them in certain places, normally to try and control erosion and some of the bigger trees, anything under 2 feet, they would chip. And so they had to cut those up, and because then those logs laying down there are now considered to be surface fuels or ground fuels, not aerial fuels. So they ended up just cutting them up and dousing them with fire, and you can see it was pretty well contained. And this was at the height of the drought. We had a little bit of rain, maybe like not even an inch of rain in the last 30 to 60 days after when the fire had occurred. So there weren't the unique conditions. And that's the one other point I want to make about this. 75% of the year, we are in great shape because we're here on the coast, we have this inversion layer out here, especially in the summer when it's hot. We get the fog comes in, not every day, like today we didn't get the fog in the morning, so it was a warm day, it's a warm day. But the fog comes in and all the trees, particularly the ones that do it the most are the redwoods. Underneath the redwoods, when the fog comes in, it's like a river. There is so much, I mean, the water actually, enough water drips off those redwood trees that it runs down in a stream and it doesn't all absorb into the ground. But the oaks also very, very, very fog adapted. They also produce a lot of fog drift. The eucalyptus also produce a lot of fog drift. The difference is these oak trees right here, they have, if you look at this with a microscope, there's little tiny pores on the bottom of these leaves. They're called stomata. The oak trees at this time of the year, they close those down almost entirely. They do very, very little photosynthesizing because they're conserving water. Eucalyptus trees don't have that ability. They cannot, except, well, the blue gums, I'm not speaking for all species, but the blue gums, which is the major tree over here, they don't do that. They one of their nicknames is fever tree. And they call them fever trees because that's what they use for swamps. You heard of
Are you talking
mosquitoes.
about ukes or oaks?
Ukes. The eucalyptus trees, they will plant them in swamps because they don't shut down their transpiration. They photosynthesize, their stomata do not close, and they're very, very, they grow really fast and they use a lot of water. So you plant a grove of eucalyptus trees and you'll drain a swamp and eliminate problems with mosquitoes. It was part of the strategy of fighting malaria, and a number of places was to plant these blue gum trees in the swamps because it drains the swamps and then you don't have so many mosquitoes being bred and it reduces malaria. So here in the hills, they do produce a lot of water, but they deprive other species, and one of the reasons they do it is that the way their branches are shaped, they capture the water and it funnels down, it channels down the trunk. So eucalyptus trees, they capture the rain and they funnel it down towards the base, you know. So other things around them they take away. And so they do outcompete. They're so aggressive, they can outcompete almost any other species. And that's one of the reasons why they're not considered invasive anymore, or just mildly invasive, is that they're already everywhere they could actually move to, because they need to have enough water, and we don't get a lot of water. So they're invasive in riparian areas.
1 minute.
They're not going to go inland very much because you just don't have enough water for them. They can't germinate and propagate. So they've actually been considered, they're now considered mildly invasive because they can't invade it. And so I guess I covered all the bases. Yeah. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Thanks for having me and inviting me.
Now let's open it up to questions between Bob and Jack. And I don't know who wants to ask the first questions. Bob, why don't you ask questions of Jack? A question, and we'll go back the other way. And just make a brief question, and then Jack, deal with it. It'll be like up to 30 seconds on the question, maybe.
Yeah, I have questions.
You want to do it the other way? Jack,
ahead.
talk to Bob.
Okay, and it'll give you more time to think for a second.
Sure.